On the 7th of April, President Donald Trump fired a tweet aimed at the World Health Organization. By the end of May, Trump announced the US would halt its funding and pull out of the agency.
We will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization and redirecting those funds to other worldwide and deserving, urgent global public health needs.
His primary accusation is that the WHO had protected China and demonstrated a clear bias whilst the pandemic took off. For Trump's critics, his accusations have been cast as an attempt to scapegoat both the organisation and China, a political deflection from his administration's pandemic performance. Experts in global health believe the move's a devastating blow in the midst of a pandemic and suggest that a political battle between two superpowers is politicising an unwitting WHO. So what merit is there to Donald Trump's claims? And what lies ahead for the organisation at the centre of coronavirus geopolitics? The WHO was established by constitution on the 7th of April 1948. Following the Second World War, health systems had been decimated in many parts of the world, and epidemics were common. There was a need for a global body that would collect data, standardise practices, and classify emerging health diseases. A body of the UN, the organisation was an exemplar of the spirit of internationalism that prevailed following the World Wars. It describes its job as the global guardian of health.
WHO is a technical agency which provides for collaboration and coordination of global health activities. Doing that, it provides norms and standards of what's right and what's acceptable throughout the world. And it also provides guidelines to countries, and it works through a system of resolutions where its 194 member countries decide by resolution what they would like to see done in the area of global health. There is a political arm of WHO as well, and that's the arm on the top that includes ministers of health from its member countries and the Director General who's named by those ministers of health.
Since its inception, the WHO has delivered some exceptional achievements. In the 1950s, the organisation set its sights on smallpox, a disease that was still killing people in the millions despite an existing vaccine.
They eradicated smallpox. The first time a disease has been stopped by human activity, coordinated through the WHO. They're about to do the same, we hope, with polio, almost there with polio. So you can see the benefit of these systems in health much more than you could in trade or education or the other aspects where the intergovernmental agencies operate.
But as the close of the 20th century approached, it was becoming clear that the organisation wasn't without its problems. Critics claimed the organisation was slow to identify the HIV/AIDS threat, and there was a sense it had lost some of its initial impetus. The WHO is, and was, a surprisingly small organisation. Today, its annual budget is around $2.4 billion per year, split across a dizzying array of projects in global health. Yet this budget is still smaller than some university hospitals, and there are limits to its capacity to monitor for emerging diseases. The next critical problem for the organisation is its lack of real political power. It has no ability to bind its members to actions or to sanction them. It doesn't have legal authority to enter countries without permission or to force countries to take its advice. It relies primarily on diplomacy.
The bureaucracy of the WHO is legendary. It has a huge number of member states, and it's bound by the views of those members, and where members are not agreeing, then it has to come to a consensus, which is inevitably a compromise.
The turn of the century brought with it the leadership of Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland. The former Prime Minister of Norway, Brundtland was direct and well versed in the political arena. She championed proactive means to deal with some of the organisation's biggest problems. At the start of the SARS outbreak in 2003, when China became aware of the novel virus, it failed to report it to the WHO. The organisation had been tracking Chinese medical boards and received an alert from an internal source. Brundtland chose to tackle China directly with the information.
If we look at China, there still is a considerable number of cases every day and in a number of provinces. So certainly we have not seen a peak in China yet.
Brundtland actually accused China publicly of putting the rest of the world at risk for not reporting and not working with WHO. As a result, the next day, the vice premier was on a plane to Geneva, met with the director general, understood the issues, apologized, went home, and China became an extremely important partner in the SARS outbreak.
Brundtland was prepared to act without authority to take steps such as issuing travel warnings to affected areas without approval from governments. Fewer than 1,000 people would die from SARS, and the WHO's response was widely lauded as a tremendous success. It managed to defeat the pandemic without a vaccine, and its interventions sound familiar today. Test, track, trace, and isolate. The success following SARS saw the implementation of the IHR, the International Health Regulations. This would be the first legal framework binding member states to WHO instructions. It requires countries to prepare for public health threats to standards set by the WHO and to report any outbreaks. It also provides the WHO with the power to declare a public health emergency of international concern, or FAIC. But the document stopped short of providing the organisation with power to respond if a nation refused to comply.
The WHO is not an organisation that can kick down doors and demand access. It really exists by the consent of its members, and it needs to tread gently if it's to get cooperation.
The first test of the IHR's mechanism arrived in 2009 with the H1N1 influenza pandemic. The then Director General Margaret Chan declared the world's first public health emergency of international concern. The agency issued recommendations that, among other things, advised against trade and travel measures.
In the early stages, the danger was that the outbreak might prompt widespread panic. Now, the danger is complacency.
At that time, going over to Geneva, dealing with Margaret Chan, who was the Secretary General of the WHO, was to galvanise the rest of the world to take this seriously. And I think the problem the WHO face is this issue about, does government really have to trigger all these processes, their biggest fear being panic amongst the population.
The pandemic was quickly resolved, but critics believe the organisation acted hastily, overestimating the threat, creating panic and inflicting economic damage. Debate continues as to whether this could have been a case of pandemic paradox, where the better the pandemic's managed, the less of a threat it would seem to have presented in the first place.
There was a review of the WHO's action by about 30 independent flu experts, and there was nothing like severe criticism. If anything, it was the opposite.
Then, in 2014, came the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. This was perceived as a disaster for the WHO and its implementation of the IHR. For the second time, Director General Margaret Chan's leadership was brought under focus. Chan failed to act on information the WHO had received from non-governmental sources, failed to confront governments that sought secrecy, and only declared the public health emergency of international concern after the epidemic had already reached crisis. A delay possibly influenced by the extensive criticisms that Chan and the WHO had been trigger-happy during the H1N1 outbreak.
With any pandemic, it's unlikely that the WHO will be absolutely right and get its timing perfect. It's just unlikely. So what you tend to get is a seesawing effect.
Following a review of its performance during Ebola, widespread restructuring and recommendations were implemented within the organisation. The recommendations found that the organisation should exercise greater political leadership in crisis.
The Director Generals of the WHO obviously play an important role. They set the tone for the organisation. They set the strategy for the organisation. And perhaps most important of all, in a crisis like this, they're seen as the public face of the organisation.
Appointed in 2017, Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus was the first leader to be appointed from the African continent. Dr. Tedros had been the health minister and later foreign minister in Ethiopia, a repressive government known for its human rights abuses. Right out of the starting block, Dr. Tedros found controversy. His appointment of Robert Mugabe as a goodwill ambassador for the WHO was lambasted. After a fierce backlash, Dr. Tedros was forced to rescind the appointment. Today, Dr. Tedros is tasked with the biggest and most threatening pandemic of the organization's history. From the outset of the crisis, the organization's come under scrutiny for being soft on China. The WHO has stated that the agency's epidemic surveillance system, which gathers reports and rumours of outbreaks, only picked up on the outbreak on the 31st of December 2019, on the day China made its official report to the WHO.
It's pretty clear from leaked tape recordings that have come out of the WHO that they were as frustrated as anyone about not getting data out of China quick enough.
Seeking access to Hubei, Dr. Tedros opted not to call China out directly, and instead a closed-door meeting was held with Xi Jinping in Beijing. Publicly, Dr. Tedros took to praising Chinese efforts to contain the disease, and the day following this show of public support, the WHO was granted access. The same day, a public health emergency of international concern was officially declared, and the WHO started to issue advice and prescriptions to member states. For supporters of Dr. Tedros, vindication of his strategy, public praise, private pressure, came with access to the region and the cooperation of the Chinese government. But for Dr. Tedros's critics, the backdoor diplomacy cost the organisation legitimacy and authority.
The strategy taken by the WHO leadership was to flatter China publicly so that it didn't get its back up and would be more cooperative. I think, though, you can also look at how the WHO has dealt diplomatically with the Trump administration. And again, you see the same sort of pattern of behaviour. And so you can see on both sides, they have to tread very carefully with politicians and leaders who are prickly.
As further evidence of the WHO's China bias, Trump suggested that the organisation ignored evidence of human-to-human transmission, detailed in an email from Taiwan on the 31st. The WHO refutes this claim, and the email, which has since been published, contains no such information. The email sent requested more information on atypical pneumonia cases that had been isolated for treatment in Wuhan, which officials in Taiwan had picked up on social media posts from China. Yet this does suggest that the pandemic was already politicised before it began.
It's the same right across the political spectrum. I mean, I went as Trade Secretary to visit Taiwan, and there was a huge diplomatic fallout with China. You know, the history of this with Chiang Kai-shek and getting a seat at the UN and China not being recognised, and then suddenly China being recognised, all of that affects all spheres of international life. You can't pretend that the WHO can somehow be free of this political minefield.
And here lies the flaw. The WHO cannot operate without the goodwill of its member states, and especially without that of the countries to which it requires access. The best facility it has to deal with uncooperative or bad actors is the active political backing of the other 193 member states. When global cooperation's under pressure, so too is the organisation's ability to speak truth to power. The limit of the WHO's powers during this pandemic is again exemplified when looking beyond China to other member states' responses to WHO pronouncements. The WHO's decision to officially announce the pandemic on March the 11th was designed to drive some action amongst its members. The legal mechanism of a public health emergency of international concern should spring countries into gear when triggered. The WHO noted in its announcement of the pandemic the alarming levels of inaction.
And we're deeply concerned both by the alarming levels of spread and severity and by the alarming levels of inaction. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
From the outset, the message from the WHO has been clear: test, 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 and solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. Individual states should limit public exposure through test, track, trace, and isolate. And the organisation has stressed international cooperation on scientific information and resources.
In February, early February, they issued advice to countries. Test, 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 they said. 3 countries followed that: Singapore, South Korea, Germany.
Nations instead have often ignored the advice, and once again, the WHO can only rely on its diplomacy to keep all its members seated around the table in pursuit of common goals and actions. In the COVID-19 pandemic, the world's most powerful countries are demanding that the WHO follow their respective sovereign interests for reasons other than that of global health, and that bodes ill for international health cooperation. Donald Trump's decision to break ties with the organisation raises a host of its own questions, including the cost and the inherent politics of replacing the agency.
Trump's play where he says, right, we're going to withdraw the funding. The reason it really doesn't have any teeth is because the WHO's funding is pretty small. If European countries wanted to top it up, it's really pocket change.
Once we're clear of the threat of this pandemic, the WHO's already committed to a full review process, a procedure which is standard for the agency. Perhaps for the leaders who are invested in global health, a valuable line of questioning might be to examine the limited political powers in the IHR and the political backing of the WHO when international corporations seem fractured.
Despite the geopolitical tensions in the world today, WHO as a technical organization is functioning as it always has, and it hopefully will in the future. It takes information from countries from around the world, analyzes it with its expert bodies, and makes recommendations that help the world understand what's the best way forward.
If there's a reason to treasure the WHO, it's not because it's got great powers. It's not a police force and never has been. The reason to treasure it is because it's an archipelago of the most amazing expertise. So it spans the world and it has access to the very best scientists from the very best universities right across the world. And because it has great status in that community, it has no trouble at all pulling that advice where it's needed. And there's nothing in the world like it.